Now, are you ready for the first actual speaker for our Tiny Houses and Eco Village Part 2? Are you ready? Yes. All right, good. Now, I would love you to join with me in welcoming Dr. Brian Stockwell, who's a councillor for the Noosa Shire Council. Brian, you have to guess what he's a doctor in, and I'll tell you, it's not medicine. I actually think he's a doctor in being awesome. That's yet to be denied. So I'm going to stand with it. Brian, though, today is going to share a long time, like many decades worth of interest and passion and work and study into the idea of sustainable living, sustainable development and agriculture and all that sort of stuff. It's really great, Brian. We appreciate you being here. Thanks so much for kicking us off.
All good. And just before I heard a challenge, so I'll rise to the challenge. Get away from me, don't ever talk to me again. No, I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners, past, present and emerging, and I always like when I do that to actually ground it in something fairly local. And what we do know about the first eco villages in this neck of the woods is they were our traditional owners. There was an early occupation. If we look at, say, the Cooloola sandmass, it's only been around as a place to live since the last ice age, so it's probably had 13,000 years of history. And the early people who lived on the North Shore and up into the Cooloola, the men used to go behind and hunt in the rainforest. The women used to go to the beach and gather. And that population, according to Ian McNiven's PhD, it sort of dwindled and died away for a period. And that was all a result of a changing climate. And that's something we all have to think about today, is what's going to happen to our settlements as climate changes the environment. For them, it meant it lost the rainforest resources. There wasn't enough rain to support the rainforest that they were using for their protein. Okay, then there was the next, probably about 1,500, 2,000 years ago, the next wave of Indigenous occupation. And what Ian McNiven found is that they did what I was talking about. They designed their villages with nature. So if you're going around the swamps around here, you probably realise there's a few mozzies. And if you realise before the days of fly screens that might cause you to get sick and might not make you sleep real well. So what he found was that all the areas up to the north of us from the river here is there were 7 semi-sedentary villages, and they tended to be on the high ground where the gum trees were, where the sea breezes were such that you didn't get as many mozzies. So they're designing where they lived based on the natural environment. And that's probably the underlying theme of what I'm going to talk about. The other thing I noticed when I went out to Doonan, I recognised a whole lot of faces and a whole lot of people my age who'd been around since this era. Then I saw there's a whole lot of millennials and Gen Ys who were talking the same language we did in the 70s and early 80s when we moved here. So that's the other theme today, is it's about looking what drove the same movement in the 70s and 80s to what's driving the movement now. And you'll see up there's a quote. It said, the purpose of the festival, and he's talking about the Down to Earth Festival, just by way, there you go. That picture up there, that's me. It's not a snap out of living in the 70s. We really did look that bad. On my feet are KT26s. Have they become a hipster icon yet, or no? No. Okay. So back to the quote. The purpose of the festival is to show the urgent need to shape alternatives now. Ways must be found because of the violent, acquisitive, alienated industrial society which now poses a threat to survival. People have for centuries searched for equality and the right and ability to determine their own development. What was the profession of the person who said that? Any guesses? No one. Would it surprise you that it was the Barnaby Joyce of the time? Okay? Jim Cairns. It was after he was a minister in the Whitlam government. But why? Yeah, Barnaby wouldn't say anything like that, would he? Now, everyone my age will know what the similarity between Barney and Jim Cairns is. Yeah, come on. Hey, office relationship. So Jim Cairns and Junie Morosi were a bit of a thing that the media used to love. And that bus up there, oh, this is what I do. That bus up there, if that isn't the one I rode in between the Down to Earth Festival in Berry to Adelaide in 1978, then it's something very similar to it. So Jim Cairns was there with Junie Morosi. They're on the main stage, you know, like it's going to be like, oh, who we got? Sandy Bolton tomorrow with a packed audience, thousands of people there, TV cameras rolling, and Jim's trying to be serious about this new alternative society. He hadn't counted on the fact that young people being what they are, there was a big mud bath on the banks of the Murray River. And just as he was giving his most serious speech, about 200 nude, mud-clad people ran across the TV camera. Times like that, you wish you had a mobile phone, but obviously we didn't at that stage. Anyway, so what did Jim say? Jim said the internal social crisis of today that results from these contradictions means that we must shape the alternatives now. There is not just one alternative. The new society will be made up of the choices of multitudes of people, individuals, groups, who are determined to find a way out. And I think what we're seeing with tiny houses now and the push to eco-villages is people trying to find their way out of a system that's alienating people from owning their homes, a system that's making it unaffordable for not just young people, but you know, in Noosa we have a significant issue with affordable housing for single women over 50. So some of these problems keep going on. A bit about me, just so you know where I come from. This is just before I lived in Noosa, and I actually, my vehicle at the time would now be called a luxury tiny house. It was a converted old baker's van, a big old Bedford with tandem wheels at the back. It had a double bed and a roll-top desk. Okay? And I used it to go around a whole lot of communities. But this was where we had our share house. This was the sort of urban equivalent of a down-to-earth community down the back of Tallabudra. And I made a little bit of money selling organic baskets and things like that. But we tended to be where all the hippies came in. This was the Brisbane place where they'd come and steal our food. There are problems with living in community-style housing. Okay? I was lured here by the promise of a permaculture institute at Tewantin. So one of the early days of permaculture started by Max Lingdig around here. A early member had a horse and run a race, and she donated a block of land down here on McKinnon Drive. There had been a previous caretaker, and he'd left something that looked a little bit like that. So that was my second tiny house. That one's actually, I have got a photo, but I couldn't find it. That one's in better nick. But I made it bigger because I had a lean-to tent from my grandmother, so I thumbtacked it to the side and put a bed underneath that. So we were driven by a whole lot of media, and this Grassroots magazine, you can see it's important stuff that are covered: pendulum power, gourds, hay band weaving, making a tether, herbs, pulling a bore, and conserving water. But that would come out every month, and you'd read it religiously if you're in your urban area, and you'd try and do some of it on your block. Whoop. There we go. And that was my move from a tiny house to a small house. That was my first house. I was owner builder. You can see there's 4 panels on there. It wasn't quite constructed, so I think we end up with a massive 6, and lived there happily for a few years. But obviously the 70s wasn't the first time we've had communities in Noosa. The first commune, there's actually 2 of them. And they were driven by a piece of legislation that, if you read it, you wouldn't believe it was from Queensland. It was after the 1893 flood. A whole lot of people who were living in makeshift accommodation on the lowlands of Brisbane. 1893 is still the biggest flood in recorded history. They wanted to try and give them an inducement to move to more safe areas. So they put this bit of legislation to. It was a communistic model. If you wanted a block of land somewhere that was higher in a lovely part of the world around Noosa, for example, you had to pool all your worldly assets. That was one of the conditions. Pool the assets, managed as a community. And 2,000 people across Queensland did this. One just down here, Wollongabba, was 4,000 hectares on Lake Wyber, and was a strongly religious group. And the founder was a Messianic, you can see that word, promulgation of Christian communism. And for the time, he was pretty advanced because money was banned and men and women were equal. That one, because it had such a strong religious fervour, it didn't last very long because they actually found it very difficult to live around the wetlands of Lake Wyber in 1894. Another one that did go much longer was the Protestant Unity Group, and they were started from a perfectionist movement. And this perfectionist ideology was that said, if you put people in an ideal natural environment, they'll be ideal natural people. You non-believers. Okay, it was between Mount Karura and Skyring Creek. From the history written by Bill Metcalf, who's done the most research in Australia about eco-villages, he sort of suggested he think most of the people born in there realised that they could pool their worldly possessions for a little while, and then they had the chance of just saying, no, we want our block of land. And that's what happened here. They had a couple of shysters as their community leaders, and then they all basically selected one part of the commune and started to live and work normally. There was actually a store here, and they realised the big place at the time was Coran, because it was a big milling town. They needed to get to the train quicker, so they actually got a siding, and that siding is now what we call Pomona. Interestingly, both the ex-mayor Noel Playford and the current president of the Noosa Chamber of Commerce are both descendants from those first settlers. But in modern times, is this Noosa's first eco-village? While I'm talking, see if you can recognise it. So this exists. It's got not one living area, not two living areas, not three living areas. It's got organic vegetables, and because it's got a bit of a farm, it can have a workers' accommodation, and it's got a fourth living area and a shared kitchen and laundry. Now, does anyone recognise it? The music's a clue to the owner, which I reckon everyone in this room knows one of the owners of this property. Does anyone recognise the music from my era? Yeah. And whose first record was that? So have I been telling a fib? I was playing around with a bit of cut and paste. The development's real. Everything I said was correct, except I might have put an organic farm on the tennis court. And I might have sort of cropped out the river and put in another property beside it. But the principle is there. So this is now a resort, but when it was built as a single dwelling. And I'm going to give you 3 models for eco-village, and that's the first one. One of the most probable types of eco-villages is where you're sharing a large, what I call exploded house or pavilion house, and the only thing that you have to do is connect it. Why they saw all those long walkways that connect those living areas, okay? It doesn't have to be as expensive as Makepeace Island, but it's a model where you're still having your own separate area, but you're sharing certain resources and facilities, and particularly if you just got the approval for one dwelling house, you don't have 2 laundries and you don't have 2 kitchens. But if you do have primary production in the rural area, and it generates a need for a caretaker's accommodation building is permissible, but also if you have anywhere in Noosa Shire, you can, with enough ground, you can have a secondary dwelling. So a secondary dwelling can be not attached, up to 65 square metres, and the issue we're having at the moment, the new legislation said it should be one household, and one household's not defined. I actually think in the modern era, sharing a single household is probably dictated as whether you have a beer on a Friday afternoon together. But that's one thing you have to look at. So there's one model of an eco-village. And where can you do it? So one of the questions that I'm always asked is, why isn't Noosa like northern New South Wales and we'll do multiple occupancies? You know? And the answer is really simple, is we're not allowed to in the vast majority of Noosa Shire. So the SEQ regional plan that covers the whole of South East Queensland is a statutory plan, and one of its most successful elements was containing development and the push to just have fragmented development. And from a rural eco-village perspective, it puts this constraint on it. The minimum lot size is 100 hectares. So can we have multiple occupancy in all that area in Noosa that's coloured light green? No. What we can have, however, is a whole lot of Makepeace Islands, okay? So there's nothing stopping you from looking at that. You can also find, obviously, places that have already got 2 or 3 houses. So there's one opportunity. Look at it. Don't look at it, you know, a 50-house community. Can I start a small one where we've got a really close relationship with the people who are sharing the land? So that's model 1. I thought design with nature, there's 2 concepts. The first one is one that most people associate with Noosa, and I'll just do that first. And that's recorded now in our Noosa design principles, but it's really came out of the 82 to 85 council. We had a few architects, a few really long-term thinkers. One became the judge of the High Court of Papua New Guinea, who was living in a community at the time. Okay? And they produced this concept that we should design with nature, and developers are encouraged to build and strengthen our uniqueness. Some of the things you'll see there: work with the existing natural features, value existing trees, provide appropriate trees, choose endemic species, replace lost vegetation. And then on the other side, use natural materials, use rock facing, design stormwater systems to filter silt and rubbish, use natural timber, etc. So it's this concept that not only do you design with natural materials, but when you're designing around what's there to start with. And that's why Noosa's a little bit different to a lot of communities on the eastern seaboard. And if we look at what might be the pinnacle of that and play this video, and I thought since it's a surf festival we should use surf music.
Conjured up your being, your size, your time, your shape. You were created with all the beauty they could call. And earth, you surely are the measure of them all. Your rocks all turn to gold and your tiny stones to jewels. And when the swirling mists had cleared, you stood so pure and placed so carefully each and everything that belonged. Earth, you were magnificent through the...
So I'll stop it there, but you get the idea. Now that was designed with really good community involvement. So I was involved 4 years ago as the local residents and ratepayers. And the initial design concepts about biomimicry, about whether we should be looking at the rainbow serpent or whether we should be reflecting the waves coming in. And you find that that design was deliberate in terms of every tree or sapling with a thickness about as thick as my thumb was actually mapped. And the course was mapped so it would minimise how many bits of tiny bit of vegetation was moved. But it's also got that same sinuosity. I tried to capture that by looking at the bark. Same sinuosity as nature has, both in the horizontal plane, you know, the vertical plane, the way it goes up and down, but also it was specially designed with the arms of the banisters were designed to also have that. So that's sort of the pinnacle of where that Noosa design ethic gets to. And it was designed to be iconic. It was very expensive, but the response as soon as people got exposure to it was their pride in living or visiting Noosa. So if we bring that now to a statutory context, it's how's those design principles put into the new planning scheme. And this came out last week as a draft for comment. And one of the things we've got in there is the Sustainable Building Design Code. I can tell you that we tried to make this a little bit more detailed and assertive, but the state government said no, if it's anything in the Australian Building Code, a planning scheme can't cover. So we've just got some broad principles like Development is located, designed, constructed and operated in accordance with best sustainable design principles. Development responds to site, topography, orientation, prevailing winds and existing vegetation, similar to our semi-sedentary villages up on the North Shore. Development incorporates water-sensitive urban design, principles to manage stormwater, fairly common these days. Development includes passive design elements to respond to local climate. Reliance on non-renewable resources is minimised. Buildings are designed and constructed to be energy and water efficient, have energy efficiency in them, retain where possible and create shade and cooling on site, and stormwater is collected on site for non-potable purposes, gardening, toilet flushing, laundry and hot water supplies. Healthy indoor environments are provided by incorporating the use of non-low toxic material, natural light and cross-ventilation. So these are things that will, if that passes into a code, that any accessible development, not your little house, these will be things that we'll be trying to condition. We already do it, but this will give us a stronger case. We'll be listening to what the public says. We tried to make a whole lot of, personally, we tried to push for mandatory solar and rainwater tanks on all houses, and that was one of the things the state government said it can't be controlled by a planning scheme. But I'm keen to hear if people there in a planning submission want us to challenge the state government on that. So the second concept with design for nature comes from this book. And this was the planning principle that got the 1997 strategic plan. And most people who only know one thing about Noosa is they think about the 1997 strategic plan and they think about the term population cap, which was never in there. What it did, it used the principles that outlined by McHarg, who was a Scottish landscape architect and regional planning, using natural systems sort of advocate, if not iconic innovator, who published this book in 1969. And it is still one of the most celebrated books on landscape architecture and land use planning. It led to things like ecological planning, but also GIS. So when I was first trained as a planner, we would be trained to colour in tracing paper to do overlays. And this is all what he developed. He developed the concept of overlaying, and this is what the whole technology of GIS came out of, this concept of being able to put multiple layers over the top to determine geographic planning issues. It's described as a planning policy with ecological sensibility that accepted the interwoven worlds of the human and the natural and sought more fully and intelligently design human environments in concert with the conditions of setting, climate and environment. And to me, if we're going to do eco-villages, this still tells us what the main principles are. It can't be that you go to the real estate agent and say, oh, what a wonderful view, what a nice house, let's put some more houses on it. It has to be, if we're going to be serious about making these villages ecologically sound, we have to do some of these principles. And what I thought we'd do is, I was actually keen during the planning scheme development process to identify a site where we could say, this is a really good site for an off-grid community. And this would be something we could use as a demonstration. So staff actually went through. And the site I thought of was Pomona, because Pomona, if you see that big pink area, it's in what we call the urban footprint of the regional plan, so it gives you a lot of flexibility. But if you just look at this settlement pattern, you see that there appears to be significant areas that are already zoned for rural residential, which allows smaller lot size, but it doesn't tell you enough. If you're looking at the planning scheme, you look at the zones, but most importantly, you look at the overlays. So here's Pomona. You can see there appears to be a whole lot of vacant land around the urban area, and I just told you that it's under the regional plan, we can develop it. So is it suitable for an off-grid eco-village? That's the current zones with large areas, still some large blocks there sitting in the pink, which is urban, and some larger blocks that are unsubdivided in the rural residential. So if we apply McHarg's principles, and I said, all within the urban footprint, which is a good thing. McHarg's principles looking at nature. Contours. Quick lesson on contours. The further apart the lines, the flatter it is. So you can see some of the constraints are going to be purely related to how steep the land is. You can see that the lines that are the most distant apart is where the existing urban development is. Some of that slope goes into landslide risk. So you want to take out any area that your house is going to roll down the hill after a good wet season. Then, if you're going to be sustainable, you're going to have to look after the food growing area. So that's the state planning policy for agricultural land, good quality agricultural land. So you say, well, if we're going to be ecological, we don't want to build on the soils and the land that are most suitable to grow food into the future generations. So that has to be taken out from your consideration. We've also got a state planning policy about koala habitat. And you see there, dark green is existing and the light green is the habitat that's most potentially koala habitat. So you can say, well, probably wouldn't want to develop in there. And then the other one that really knocked out a lot of opportunity was when we looked at flood and fire hazard. And you can see that fire hazard around natural areas, we've got state planning policies that say, really, height of a tree times 1.5 is the closest you can have for a house. So you can see this concept of design with nature is, well, the reason why places are developed where they are is that we tend to do that naturally. And what the planning scheme does since 1997 is do that in a more rigorous fashion. We also have the biodiversity and waterway layers, so the riparian corridors. So when you do all that, you don't come up with the bonanza of opportunities for eco-villages around Pomona, which is probably without looking at the constraints, the most suitable area because it's got shops, it's got high school, it's got primary school. But there are opportunities, and this is just a quick one, and I haven't been looking at my watch, but I'm sure someone will gong me if I go too long. This is the second model that I thought people were thinking about. When you go out, you might not see one block of land, but you might have 2, 3. So this is a cross-section block of land. It's got a creek down the bottom. It might have some camphor laurel there that if you're doing good, you'd want to rehabilitate. It's got good quality land down on the floodplain that's good for growing stuff. Up on the steep slopes, you've got a whole lot of gum trees, which might be koala habitat. And if you look along, and produce that as a sort of a landscape, what you find is that you've got all these straight line subdivisions that go through it. And so for each one of these blocks, lot 1, lot 2, lot 3, lot 4, you find you've got this tiny little constrained house site area, some better than others, and if you just did conventional subdivision, you might get a couple of extra lots. However, what you could do in this context is not click twice. I must have put in another slide. Okay, I'm not going to go through the set of strategic outcomes. These are the big picture things. There we go. That's the one I thought I was getting to. Not that one. Okay, so will it be possible to live and work? There is definitely a slide missing, which is unfortunate. It's a group title. So if you look at that site, this is what you get for too much animation when you're doing it at 12:30 last night. There we go. If you looked at that in plan view, the sensible thing is to talk to, or if you've got enough money, buy all those blocks and combine those blocks into one. And then look at how you create an eco-village through group title where each little individual area might have its own small lot, but the most of it's going into common land. So your koala land can go into voluntary conservation agreement. Your good quality, you might share farm. We've already got a number of share farmers around here. You might rehabilitate it and you might keep that fire break, and you might include a shared workspace. Okay? And I think that's important, is that if you look at new ways to do it, you can get twice as many lots if you design sensibly on the same area of land. But the shared workspace is something that is coming up more and more, is can we create these villages where you're not jumping in the car to drive 50 k's to work? And so we're going to have to start thinking about how do we work and live at home, and how do we design our eco-villages with it. So that's one thing the new plan does actually stimulate. It actually has a lot more flexibility for rural and rural residential about home businesses. Things it talks about include, things like based on growing food, as well as value-adding operations such as cooking classes or farm gate sales or local scale manufacturing. But more generally, it talks about how we're going to allow creative industries, studios, workshops, professional personal offices, clinics for health practitioners. So these are all the things. So in Pomona, where we're talking about, it actually says, you know, it tries to get different areas where we're clustering things. So traditional and emerging rural enterprises, health and wellbeing, hospitality. So what we have to think about in our developments is not just designing them to live, but designing them to live and work and create an environment where it's enjoyable to do so. And I thought I'd finish with option 3. And that is a well-known development in one of our rural towns that I voted against. And yet I'm not on something. It's not an eco-village. But can we learn from it? It's a relocatable home park. You mightn't believe it. That's what a relocatable home park looks like these days. You know, you're paying upwards over $500,000 for each one of those cheek by jowl houses in there, but because they're on sleds and can be lifted off onto a truck, it can be a relocatable home park. Now, places like Pomona, where you're in the urban footprint, relocatable home parks are a real opportunity for tiny house communities. And they don't have to be as large or as dense as that. And I thought it'd be appropriate, tiny houses, just to give you the quick heads up. Bit of debate, but definitely less than 3 months, no planning. We're currently getting legal opinion. There is difference of opinion about whether it being a vehicle, whether in excess of 3 months, it also is exempt. Definitely, if it's a secondary dwelling, one less and less than 65 square metres, that's fine. If you've got multiple kitchens and you want it for permanent living, then it becomes defined under the planning scheme a relocatable home park. And there are advantages of going down that route in terms of development applications. So my final point is old ideas are, the missing word, renewable. And there we go. That's our human sign a few weeks ago. I'm sure you all noticed me there. But I hope that, you know, from starting in the 70s and going to now, the same drivers are always there. There's always that need to look at how we live to better suit the environment, better suit the climate, and to better suit how we separate ourselves from a broad industrial system of living and economy into a new way that treads more lightly on the earth. So thank you.
So what do you reckon Brian's a doctor of?
PhD.
He's got a PhD, and Brian, just confirm what that was in.
The title was Fragticulture, and I can't, increasing the resilience and sustainability of coastal peri-urban agriculture.
That's catchy, isn't it? Have you ever noticed with PhDs?
And
they're
I
always
found out
catchy.
3 years after I finished, the short answer is environmental geography.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, thank you so much, Brian. Brian, you're going to be sticking around today,
I know,
Brian?
I said,
That's it. You don't want to be talked to.
Don't talk,
Rightio. So if Brian will be around, so if there's stuff that Brian's talked about or he's only just touched on and you would like further information or sort of dig a little bit deeper, can I encourage you to come and find Brian and actually speak to him? It might be about unplugging. It might be about unpacking some of the Noosa plan a little bit more. It might just be around, you know, some of the logistics of what that looks like. It could even just be about the interest around how the actual walkway, boardwalk thing was actually worked through and how that came to be. But come and talk to Brian. Would you join me again in just saying a big thank you to Dr. Brian Stockwell? It's also just worth acknowledging that we just do thank Noosa Shire Council for their support and interest in this type of event particularly, and we really do appreciate their engagement in this conversation because it's an important one. Now, a couple of things. So for those of you who just new, might have only just walked in, my name's Tim. I'm like your air hostess, except I don't serve you food, and if there is an emergency, I don't stay calm. So apart from that, we're exactly the same.